Welcome, wee ones, to Scottish Murders. Dawn will shortly be taking you through a solved or unsolved murder involving people from or living in Scotland. So get ready to hear about the darker side of bonny Scotland.
Before I begin, a lot of the information for this episode came from two specific books, one being Gone Fishing by Chris Clark and Adam Lloyd. It was Saturday the 11th of June 1977, and 37-year-old Frances Barker had spent the day at her sister's home in Parkhead in the East End of Glasgow, letting off steam, happily drinking and having a laugh after a long week working at the bakery. Having had a good day and plenty to drink, Frances decided in the late afternoon it was time to go home, and so a taxi was called for her. When it arrived, Frances's niece, Lily, who was 23 at the time, helped Frances out to the taxi and made sure she got in okay, as she was a bit unsteady on her feet. Lily waved the taxi off with Frances in it, not realising that this would be the last time she saw her Aunt Frances alive. The taxi driver drove Frances to her home in Maryhill Road in Glasgow, just a 16-minute drive away, where Frances, still unsteady on her feet, got out and headed towards her home. The taxi driver watched Frances for a second or two to make sure she was okay, but then got another call and headed off before Frances had made it to her front door. Frances was only reported missing a week later when her colleagues became worried that she hadn't been to work. The police were called, but despite speaking to neighbours and appealing for information, nobody had seen or heard anything. Frances had simply vanished. Sadly, her body was found on a quiet lane 16 days later, just outside the village of Glenboig, about 15 miles or 24 kilometres east of where she had last been seen outside her home. Frances was found half naked, with her legs tied together using her tights and her arms tied using her scarf. Her knickers had been put into her mouth to gag her, and she had been raped and then strangled, and left in a wooded area covered with leaves and branches to try to hide her body. According to the book Gone Fishing, the police investigating Frances's murder came to the conclusion quickly that she had likely been picked up and murdered by a kerb crawler, and so they visited the red light district to speak to the sex workers there to try to establish a likely candidate, and they wouldn't be disappointed. One particular lorry driver had been frequenting the red light district and picking up sex workers so often that one of the workers had actually taken down the lorry's number plate. The lorry was traced to a Thomas Ross Young, who was 44 years old. When his lorry was forensically examined, hairs belonging to Frances were found, and when his home was searched, a distinctive green make-up compact owned by Frances was found under the floorboards. The case was strong, but it only became stronger when another sex worker who had recently been raped picked Thomas Young out of a lineup. Thomas Young was arrested, and when he appeared in court, he was not only charged with Frances Barker's murder, but also 7 other charges, all but one being sexual in nature. Thomas Young had also been charged and found guilty of raping a 19-year-old woman in 1967, for which he received 18 months in prison, as well as being questioned in the same year following the disappearance of a 17-year-old girl who he had picked up and had sex with, but he had said that he had dropped her off near her home afterwards. And sadly, as there was no body or evidence, there was nothing the police could do. Shortly after being released from his 18-month prison sentence for rape, he then was charged and found guilty of raping a 15-year-old girl, for which he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. So had he escalated from rape to murder? The police believed so and felt they had a strong enough case to take Thomas Young to trial for Frances Barker's murder, although not everyone agreed, and some felt he could have been set up so easily given his past record. Thomas Young's trial took place in October 1977 at the High Court in Glasgow, where the jury took just 1 hour to find him guilty of Frances's murder, and he was sentenced to 30 years, which was the longest prison sentence to be handed down in Scotland at that time. But was Thomas Ross Young the murderer of Frances Barker? So because the police had quickly caught Thomas Young for Frances's murder, holding him in custody until his trial and conviction, the people of Glasgow felt safe to go about their business again. On the 5th of August 1977, nearly 2 months after the disappearance and murder of Frances Barker, 20-year-old Anna Kenny was getting ready for a night out in Glasgow. Anna lived with her dad Francis, mum Mary and brother Frank, and had recently got a job working in a brewery, along with her best friend Wilma Sutherland. The pair were inseparable, and having spent a long week at the brewery, they both were looking forward to a night out, spending their hard-earned wages on a drink or two. The latest pub to be seen in Glasgow was called the Hurdy-Gurdy, and so on Friday the 5th of August, Anna and Wilma headed straight there, spending the entire evening there, chatting with friends throughout the night. The pair had started talking to a man that they both knew, who had a bit of a crush on Wilma, and shortly after, the trio were then joined by another man who was meant to be meeting a friend of his, but they hadn't shown up. Having spent the rest of the evening together, drinking and laughing in the Hurdy-Gurdy pub, at closing time the foursome then left the pub together, and Wilma and the man who fancied her hung back and had a wee kiss in a doorway, while the man who had been stood up walked Anna to get a taxi. They had a bit of a kiss too, but Anna said that she wasn't interested in anything more and was going home, at which point he said bye and started walking home himself, catching Anna begin to hail a taxi as he turned away. This would be the last time Anna was seen alive. She was reported missing to the police the next day. The police initially suspected the man who had walked Anna to get a taxi that night, but thankfully for the male, he had encountered many friends as he walked home, so they were able to provide him with a strong alibi, leaving the police with no leads, as again, despite appeals for information, nobody had seen or heard anything. Just like Francis, Anna had simply disappeared. As the months passed and neither Anna or her body were found, Anna's family and Wilma grew more tormented. However, life did go on for Wilma. Wilma could only bear to return to the Hurdy-Gurdy pub twice after Anna's disappearance, and on her second visit, just before Christmas 1977, she met and started chatting to a Gordon Hamilton. The pair started a relationship and married less than a year later in 1978, but the relationship was not a happy one. Wilma soon realised that Gordon was a drinker, a very heavy drinker, but not only that, he was also violent and had extramarital affairs, and so the marriage was short-lived. However, possibly the relationship had been doomed from the beginning, as on the day of the wedding in 1978, Gordon and his best friend had a huge falling out. So huge, in fact, that his best friend didn't attend his wedding, and the pair never spoke again. No one knows what Gordon and his best friend, Angus Sinclair, argued about that caused such a rift. On the 23rd of April 1979, 6 months into the unhappy marriage, and almost 21 months after Anna had vanished, the police came to Wilma's home and told her and her husband Gordon that remains had been found in a shallow grave in remote Skipness in Kintyre. Skipness is either about a 3-hour drive away from Glasgow, where you have to drive northwest of Glasgow first, then double back on yourself and end up southwest of Glasgow, or alternatively, you could take a car ferry there, which was more of a direct route. The remains were thought to be Anna Kenny's, which soon after was confirmed as 2 distinctive earrings were found, as well as what was left of the top she had been wearing the night she disappeared. Anna's top had been ripped and used to tie her ankles together, as well as been placed around her neck. It was believed that Anna had been raped, severely tortured, and eventually strangled with her own shirt. Anna's family were severely affected by what had happened to their daughter, and sadly Anna's dad Francis died in 1994, and her mother Mary took her own life 2 years later, leaving only Anna's brother Frank. Frank did marry and have 2 sons. However, when one son was 13 and the other 11, sadly Frank died from a heart attack. On the 1st of October 1977, while the investigation into Anna Kenny's disappearance was still ongoing and 2 months since she had disappeared, Matilda, who preferred to be known as Hilda McCauley, was getting ready for a night out. Hilda was 36 years old, was a wife and a mother of 2 sons, 13-year-old George and 9-year-old Mark. Hilda was estranged from the children's father, though, and she and her 2 boys were currently staying with Hilda's mother, Martha, in the Maryhill Road area of Glasgow. Hilda did have the full support of her mother, who every Saturday evening would look after the boys so Hilda could go out and enjoy herself. However, Hilda was still a single mother, and she worked hard to provide for her sons, holding down 2 cleaning jobs. While things for Hilda were tough, she had a great relationship with her mother and children, and it was a happy household. On Saturday, the 1st of October, like every other Saturday night, Hilda's boys, George and Mark, helped her get ready for a night out, laughing and having fun. Before Hilda left for the evening, she kissed both of her boys and said bye to them and her mother, and then she was gone. Hilda met up with 3 of her close friends that evening, where they had a few drinks in local pubs while they caught up with the week they had had, before finally heading to their favourite spot, the Plaza Ballroom, for a night of dancing. As usual, upon entering the ballroom, the friends went off in various directions to chat to other friends and have a dance. It was about 12:15 a.m. on Sunday, the 2nd of October, when Hilda collected her coat from the cloakroom attendant, and then Hilda had walked outside, presumably in the hopes of being able to get a lift home, something which she did regularly, sometimes even taking lifts from strangers. Had she maybe met a man at the ballroom who had promised her a lift home? When Hilda didn't arrive home after her night out, her mother, Martha, began to worry. It was so unlike Hilda not to come home or to call if there was a problem. Martha called around Hilda's friends, but there was no news. Nobody had seen her. All of Sunday, Martha hoped and hoped that there was a reasonable explanation for Hilda's delay, that she would walk through the door any minute. However, she didn't. And by the early evening on Sunday, the 2nd of October, Martha's worst fears became a reality. A local newspaper had reported that a body had been found in trees on waste ground in a secluded, obscure spot near the entrance to a caravan site, an area known locally as Lovers Lane, on the main road from Glasgow to Greenock, about 16 miles or 26 kilometres away from where Hilda had last been seen. If Martha had been in any doubt of the identity of the body, the description of the body and clothing confirmed to Martha that this was her daughter Hilda. Martha, in a distraught and shocked state, contacted the police and told them the description was of her daughter. Hilda had been found half naked with her hands tied behind her back and had been gagged. Hilda had suffered horrific head injuries, had been raped, and then had been strangled. While Hilda's clothing was strewn around her, items such as Hilda's bag, shoes, coat, and a hairpiece had been taken, none of which were ever found. The police launched a murder investigation, first trying to track down as many people as possible who had been at the Plaza Ballroom on the evening of Saturday the 1st of October, as any number of them could be potential witnesses. However, this task was not an easy one. The Plaza Ballroom was very popular, and it had been Saturday night. It was packed with nearly 1,000 people there that evening. Despite the appeals from the police for anybody who had been there that evening to come forward, between 250 and 300 men who had been there never did come forward. Of the people who did come forward, none of them reported anything untoward. Of those that had seen Hilda, they said she had been mostly alone, chatting with one group of friends or another, and she had been seen leaving about 12:15 a.m. by the cloakroom attendant who had regularly seen Hilda at the ballroom and who reported that Hilda appeared to be sober. When Hilda left the ballroom, it was getting towards the end of the night at this time, and it had been busy on the street, with people leaving the ballroom for the night. Despite 1,200 people interviewed in Hilda's murder inquiry, nobody had seen or heard anything that could give detectives a lead. Once again, just like with Anna and Frances, it appeared that Hilda had simply disappeared. I wasn't able to find out anything about what became of Hilda's 2 sons, George, who had been 13, and Mark, who had been 9, but presumably Hilda's mother and their grandmother, Martha, cared for them. Hilda's mum, Martha, died in 2004, without her daughter receiving justice. While Hilda McCauley's murder inquiry was in full swing in Glasgow, over in Edinburgh, about 47 miles or 75 kilometres east of Glasgow, on Saturday the 15th of October 1977, 13 days after Hilda had been murdered, 17-year-old best friends Christine, Eadie and Helen Scott were on a night out. Helen and Christine had been best friends since high school. Christine Eadie had lived with her grandmother for most of her childhood, and it had been a happy childhood. Upon leaving school at 16, Christine began working in a surveyor's office as a typist. Being very independent, Christine left her grandmother's home soon after and rented a flat in Edinburgh with one of her friends, 29-year-old Tony. Christine enjoyed going out regularly. She was very outgoing and extremely fashion conscious. Helen Scott had also left school at 16 and found herself working in a kilt shop in Edinburgh in October 1977. While Helen enjoyed this job, her long-term goal was to work in childcare, as she found herself most happy looking after children, something she regularly did for her 2 older stepsisters' children. Helen was still living at home with her parents, Margaret and Moraine, whom she had a close relationship with, and her brother Kevin. Helen was more quiet and reserved than her friend, tending not to go out as often as Christine did, and had absolutely no interest in fashion, being a country girl at heart. Where the pair may have differed in clothing styles and personality, they made up for with their shared love of pop stars Donny Osmond and David Cassidy. Before leaving for work in the kilt shop on Saturday morning, Helen told her parents that she would be going straight out after work, but that as usual they could expect her home around about 11:30 p.m. Helen apparently wasn't a fan of staying out too late. So after work, Helen, wearing her new jacket, met with another of her friends, Jackie, and the pair visited a couple of pubs where they had a chat and a catch-up, before heading to meet up with Christine and Tony at about 8 p.m. From here, the small group made their way along what is known as the Royal Mile, stopping in various pubs along the way to say hello to other friends, before eventually getting to the packed pub known as the World's End Pub about 10 p.m. The World's End Pub now marks as far as many residents could go within the old city walls, as there was a toll to exit that many couldn't afford, so it was literally the World's End, as they could proceed no further. As you can imagine, it was Saturday night and the pub was packed, with possibly as many as 250 people there that night. Christine and Helen managed to order themselves a drink at the bar, despite being slightly underage, and were then lucky enough to find a table to sit at that had just become vacant. The 4 were soon joined by more of their friends, males and females, and everybody is in high spirits. Gradually, the larger group becomes smaller again, as one by one, somebody would pair off to speak to somebody else they knew, eventually leaving just Christine, Helen, Jackie and Tony at the table. Jackie and Tony then decided they were going to mingle as well, leaving Christine and Helen alone chatting. Jackie and Tony soon returned, with news that there was a party planned and Christine and Helen were invited too, only to find the 2 friends deep in conversation with 2 men that neither Jackie or Tony had seen before. Christine and Helen seemed quite happy though, and told the other girls that they were going to stay where they were, chatting to the 2 men. While Jackie and Tony hadn't seen the men before and had no idea who they were, they didn't notice anything untoward about them, and so Jackie, Tony and others going to the party left the pub, not realising just what danger Christine and Helen would soon find themselves in. Margaret Scott, Helen's mum, was getting tired and was ready for bed, but she wanted to stay up for Helen coming in, to hear about her night out. As 11:30 p.m. passed and there was no sign of Helen, Margaret thought that Helen had probably been slightly held up, but she wouldn't be long. However, as 12:30 a.m. came round and Helen had still not come home, Margaret began to develop a feeling of dread. Margaret stayed up all night waiting for Helen, but she never came home. While filled with absolute dread, Margaret still tried to convince herself that, despite Helen never having stayed out all night before, there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Helen had stayed with Christine or Jackie, or maybe one of her other friends' homes, as maybe Helen had too much to drink and didn't want to come home in a state. Maybe. By first light, Margaret was in an awful state, and so telephoned Jackie to see if her daughter was with her. Sadly, she wasn't. Margaret, her husband Moraine, and an equally as concerned Jackie went to Christine's flat in the hope that Helen was there with Christine. The door to the flat was opened by Christine's flatmate Tony. Upon Tony hearing how Helen had not come home the previous evening, Tony knocked on Christine's bedroom door to see if she could shed any light on the situation, only to be faced with an empty room. Now the panic really started to set in. Both Helen and Christine were missing. Other friends of the pair were contacted by Margaret and Moraine Scott, but were told the same story each time. Nobody had seen Helen or Christine since the night before at the World's End pub. It was a similar story when Christine's mother, also called Margaret, was contacted, only she said she hadn't heard or seen from Christine since Thursday morning, days before the last sighting of the girls at the World's End pub on Saturday night. There was nothing else for it but to report to the police that Christine and Helen were missing. Sadly, it wouldn't be long before they received the news that both families had been dreading. At about 2 p.m. on Sunday, Christine's naked body was found face up at Gosford Bay in East Lothian, about 15 miles or 24 kilometres east of the World's End pub, and about 10 feet or 3 metres from the water. Christine had been gagged with her own knickers. Her wrists had been bound by her tights, and her bra was wrapped around her head. Christine had been badly beaten, with injuries to her neck, top half of her body, face and head. She had been stripped, raped, and then strangled with her own tights. The official cause of death was recorded as asphyxia, following strangulation by ligature and gagging of the mouth. While it was horrendous for Christine's family that her body had been found, it was equally as traumatic for Helen's family, as neither Helen nor her body had been discovered yet. The waiting for news was agonising. It would be 4 hours later, at 6 p.m, while police were still investigating the scene where Christine's body had been found, when a report came in that tragically Helen's body had been found about 7 miles or 11 kilometres away in a farmer's field. Helen had been left face down in the field, naked from the waist down and partly covered with her new jacket, with her hands bound behind her back by her own tights and belt, and her knickers were close to her face, indicating that maybe she had been gagged with them, but had somehow maybe managed to get them out of her mouth. Helen had been severely beaten, with evidence that her killer had stamped forcefully on the side of her head with their shoe, then sexually assaulted her before strangling her, but manually this time, as bruises caused by fingers were noticed under her jaw, which indicated this. While Christine and Helen's families were still in a state of shock and disbelief at what had happened, a large-scale murder inquiry began, which, according to the BBC News, on the 14th of November 2014, was the biggest manhunt in Scottish police history. It was quickly noticed from investigating where the bodies were found that all of Christine's clothing had been taken, other than her tights, bra and knickers, and a necklace and rings she had been wearing were also missing. Helen's jeans, shoes and handbag were missing, but her jacket that had been partially covering her would be vital to the investigation. The missing clothing and jewellery were never found. While some officers investigated the crime scenes and surrounding areas for evidence and clues, and roadblocks were set up, other officers began the task of tracing the movements of Helen Scott and Christine Eadie on the evening of Saturday the 15th of October, which led them straight to the World's End pub. An appeal was issued for anybody drinking in the World's End pub or who had been in the vicinity on the evening to come forward to be questioned. And as luck would have it, a policeman had been outside of the World's End pub on the very evening in question. But even better, he believed he had seen Christine, Helen, and the two men they had been seen talking to inside of the pub. PC John Rafferty was patrolling the street that the World's End pub was on that evening by foot. And he said that around 11:15 p.m. on the Saturday night, he had seen who he later believed to have been Helen and Christine come out of the pub, and as the girls were passing PC Rafferty, the girl he believed to have been Christine stumbled and fell to the ground. He said that this girl appeared to be quite drunk, and so he helped the other girl, who he believed to have been Helen, pick Christine up from the ground. The girls then started walking away. PC Rafferty then said he noticed a man watching him intently from the pub's doorway. The same male then walked towards Helen and Christine and appeared to offer them a lift. As it was getting busy on the street now, as the pubs were starting to come out, PC Rafferty got briefly distracted. But when he glanced back to where the girls had been, he saw them disappearing further along the street, this time accompanied by two men who were walking behind them, one of which was the man PC Rafferty had seen standing in the doorway. He said that he watched them for a short while and was planning on taking the number plate of the car they got into, however the foursome turned a corner and were lost to him. PC Rafferty then began to concentrate on the increasing number of drinkers leaving the pub at closing time, and the girls disappearing with the two men went clean out of his mind. That is, until the very next day. PC Rafferty said he had seen the man standing in the doorway's face for 10 seconds, and that he'd stood out to him as his clothing was completely unfashionable and out of date, describing the man as wearing a V-neck jumper and flared-type trousers with a high waistband. While it was assumed that the two girls PC Rafferty had seen were Christine and Helen, and no one else had ever come forward to say this was them that he had seen that evening, still no one was absolutely positive at this stage. Next to be questioned was Helen and Christine's friend, Jackie, who had been the last one to talk to Christine and Helen that evening, other than the two men the girls were with. Jackie told the police that she had left the pub with other friends to go to a party and left Christine and Helen talking to the two men that she hadn't known, but that while the two men seemed quiet, she wasn't getting any bad vibes from them. As more people that had been in the pub that evening were interviewed, a picture started to appear that backed up PC Rafferty's account, that Helen and Christine had been seen leaving the pub with two men shortly after 11 p.m, and that one of the men had a brooding presence. From the description and impression of the men, detectives felt that the men could have been based at the local army barracks, and so they set about the task of interviewing every soldier in the area, armed with a photo fit of the men from a number of witnesses in the pub who had seen them with the girls. This was a massive endeavour, and sadly it didn't pay off. The police had their first dead end. But that was okay, as they had a vast amount of leads that had to be investigated, as well as many anonymous letters suggesting possible suspects. All of these leads and possible suspects were investigated, but led absolutely nowhere. According to the Edinburgh News on the 11th of March 2019, in total the police had conducted 150,000 interviews, all of which were recorded on 24,000 pages of statements, all done via paper and pen and filed in filing cabinets, as this was before the era of digital records. However, despite the murder inquiry being the biggest manhunt in Scottish police history, and despite the massive amount of people who had been interviewed, the case went cold. Incidentally, on Monday the 17th of October, the day after Helen and Christine's bodies had been found, the trial of Thomas Ross Young on the charge of raping and murdering Frances Barker began. And even more incredulously, despite the similarities in the rape and murders of Frances Barker, Helen McCauley, and Christine Eadie and Helen Scott, these cases were not linked. Thomas Ross Young had been in custody, so he couldn't have carried out the subsequent murders. So was it just a coincidence that 3 other girls had been raped and murdered in very similar ways to Frances? And of course Anna Kenny had not been found at this time, but when she was found in 1979, it was determined that she too had been raped and murdered in just as similar a way. But the police did not connect these cases, at least not publicly. Helen's mother, Margaret, had never recovered from the brutal murder of her daughter. Her health started to decline and she sadly died in 1989, 12 years after Helen's murder, never having seen her daughter receive justice. Even though the cases of Frances Barker, Hilda McCauley, Helen Scott, Christine Eadie, and even Anna Kenny, even though her body had not yet been found, had not been publicly linked by the police, many parents living in Glasgow and Edinburgh began to ask questions and become increasingly concerned for their daughter's safety, especially if they were on a night out. But equally, for many living in these areas, despite the murders being upsetting and concerning, it wasn't going to stop them living their lives. One such person who thought like this was 23-year-old Agnes Cooney, who lived in Coatbridge, about 11 miles or 18 kilometres away from Glasgow city centre, with her elderly and frail aunt who needed care. Agnes Cooney had already suffered trauma and hardship from a young age, when her mother and gran died tragically when she was 17 years old, leaving Agnes, being the oldest of 5 brothers and sisters, having to abandon her dream of being a nurse to look after her siblings full-time with her dad. It wouldn't be until 3 years later when the shy, kind and caring Agnes finally got to begin the journey of becoming a nurse. In December 1977, Agnes, now being a fully trained children's nurse, had secured a job in a children's home. She was finally living her dream. On Friday, the 2nd of December 1977, Agnes had finished work for the day and had gone into Glasgow to meet her friend, Gina, who she had met while at nursing college, and Gina's boyfriend, for a meal, before going to see Gina's boyfriend play that evening with his Irish band at the Claddagh Social Club. Following their meal, the trio made their way to the Claddagh Social Club, a 16-minute walk south of Glasgow city centre, to wait for the rest of the band to arrive in the van full of equipment. Gina and Agnes helped the band unload their van before heading out front where they could enjoy the show. The pair had a great time, dancing, singing and drinking, but before long the show was over, and again Agnes and Gina went out the back to help the band load the van back up again. It was about midnight before the van was packed up again, which is when Gina and her boyfriend realised that Agnes was missing. Gina checked at the main entrance, and staff there told her that Agnes had said bye and had left quite happily not long ago to travel the 11 miles or 18 kilometres home. Gina and her boyfriend were concerned about Agnes walking about Glasgow by herself, and so they went outside checking up and down the street, as well as checking nearby bus stops for Agnes, but she'd gone. Gina was still concerned, but eventually her and her boyfriend left too, assuming Agnes had hitched a lift back home. The first Agnes's family knew there was a problem was the next day, Saturday the 3rd of December, when they received a phone call from Agnes's work to say that she had not shown up. Everybody agreed this was worrying, as Agnes was such a dependable person and would never just not show up for work. The police were called and Agnes was reported as missing. While trying to stay positive, the family were also aware of the recent murders of women in Glasgow and Edinburgh after a night out. But no, there would be a reasonable explanation for Agnes's disappearance. However, the family's hopes were dashed at 9 a.m. the following morning when Agnes's body was discovered in a field near Caldercrooks village, which is about 20 miles or 32 kilometres east of where Agnes had been enjoying herself on a night out less than 48 hours previously. Agnes's hands were tied behind her back using her own clothing. Otherwise, she was fully clothed, with one of her socks appearing to have been used as a gag, although it was no longer in her mouth. Agnes had been stabbed 26 times, with the fatal wound being to her neck. Agnes had not been sexually assaulted. It was believed that Agnes had been held elsewhere for at least 24 hours before being taken to the farm and killed, as the farmer who found her would have seen her sooner if not. A murder inquiry began, with detectives quickly establishing from interviewing witnesses that following Agnes leaving the club, she had walked alone towards the city centre. She had next been seen near the motorway trying to get a lift. This was the last sighting of Agnes alive. Other witnesses mentioned seeing a white transit van with windows near the club, as well as another witness seeing a white van near where Agnes's body had been found. However, this van was never traced, and this and all other potential leads dried up. As Agnes had not been sexually assaulted, detectives believed that this was because the murderer had been surprised at her strength and had killed her earlier than they planned. However, despite the speculation and news reports about the similarities of the murder with the previous murders, albeit this was the first stabbing, detectives still refused to connect the Glasgow and Edinburgh murders, although did concede after 2 weeks that they believed Agnes and Hilda McCauley's murders were linked, believing that a lorry or car driver on the motorway had likely been the murderer. While police didn't publicly link all of the murders, a statement was issued saying that they were bearing in mind the murders of Hilda McCauley, Anna Kenny, and Christine Eadie and Helen Scott, and that there had been certain similarities. Women were also warned not to leave dancing venues alone. Agnes's family were deeply affected by the death of their kind, caring, reliable, and fiercely protective Agnes. The fact that the murder inquiry went cold only served to further distress the family, and sadly, Agnes's dad died without Agnes receiving justice. In 6 months, from June to December, there had been 6 women murdered in very similar ways. Frances Barker thus far being the only one to have received justice after the conviction of Thomas Ross Young. But Thomas Ross Young couldn't have murdered the other women, so who was behind them? Was it a copycat? An accomplice, maybe? These questions and more went unanswered as the multiple murder inquiries carried on, before eventually going cold. 1978 came around and there had been no new murders. As the summer arrived, people of Glasgow and Edinburgh began to relax a wee bit, not forgetting the horrific and brutal murders and still hoping the killer would be caught, but they began to feel that wee bit safer again going out at night. But they were being lulled into a false sense of security. 17-year-old Mary Gallagher lived in Springburn, about 3.5 miles or 6 kilometres north of Glasgow city centre, with her parents and 6 younger siblings. Sadly, there is very little information about Mary Gallagher, other than she was very small, standing at 4 foot 11 inches, or about 1.3 metres. She was shy and worked in a factory as a machinist. It was about 6:30 p.m. on Sunday the 19th of November 1978, and just over 11 months since the murder of Agnes Cooney, when Mary left her home saying bye to her parents to go and meet a couple of her friends a short distance away, so they could all go to a social club. The distance from Mary's house to where she was to meet her friends was only a few minutes away. However, it was via a secluded path. She had been accompanied briefly on this short journey by an 11-year-old boy from the area, but when Mary and the boy saw a man standing on the pavement staring at them intently, the boy ran away in fright. Mary never did meet her friends that evening, and her body was found the next morning on wasteland near a footbridge less than half a mile or 0.8 kilometres from her home. Mary's body was naked from the waist down, with her trouser leg having been used to strangle her. Mary had been raped before her throat had been cut. A murder inquiry began, and the boy who had accompanied Mary that evening came forward as a witness. He had wanted to help the police desperately to try and track down the man he had seen, but sadly, the description he was able to give wasn't enough to go anywhere. Despite thousands of man-hours being spent on this case, despite police carrying out door-to-door inquiries and interviewing over 2,000 people and taking hundreds of statements, there were no further leads and the case went cold. Despite regular reviews of all these cold cases over the years, it wouldn't be until early 2000 when police received credible information about a possible suspect for the murder of Mary Gallagher that the investigation was reopened, which proved to have a domino effect. This is the end of part 1, but as you can tell, this story is clearly not over. There's so much more to tell in part 2 that you really don't want to miss. You can check out all the source material and photos related to these cases on our website, scottishmurders.com.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.